Welcome to the Perfectly Flawed podcast, where we share conversations with amazing people who have achieved extraordinary success through embracing their struggles and imperfections. Often they have succeeded not just despite their perceived flaws, but because of them too. Please do subscribe, leave a review, and share this with anyone else who you think might be interested. Today's episode is one in which we talk to Lis Cashin about a terrible accident that happened at school sports day with a javelin, which led to the death of her friend, and how this trauma has shaped her life and how she has learnt to come through it and move beyond it and do something wonderful for other people. Very warm welcome to you, Liz. It's so good to see you here, and thank you for coming on my podcast. I've invited you here today because I know that you've been through an incredible healing journey since I've known you. I met you at a point where you effectively, as you told me, and we'll hear more about, sort of re-traumatized yourself from a prior experience, and then you have since gone on a real journey, which I'm really excited to hear more about, in kind of recovering from that secondary trauma or that moment where everything broke open. And it'd be wonderful to hear all of that. And you are also a leadership trainer, coach, expert, and you've done women's empowerment. So all sorts of wonderful things that you're pulling together, which we'll find out more. So thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah. So the first thing that you've obviously, had some very difficult experiences through your life, but what was it about coming to a point where when we met, we were both members of the Professional Speaking Association, and you spoke on stage about your experience, and you say that speaking about that experience was re-traumatizing. What was it about speaking on a stage?
There's a lot in there, I think. But basically, I went through trauma as a child, went through major trauma. And just to give a sort of, I don't know if a trigger warning is the right thing, but I'll say it very simply. But basically, I felt responsible for the death of a friend in a tragic javelin accident at school, and didn't have any help to come to terms with it, and that led to decades of self-destruction, really. And I eventually did come around to, I'd done little bits of healing, but hadn't really got to what was underpinning everything. And then I started to write a book about my experience, and as a result of that, I'd learned so much. So obviously it was horrendous what I went through, but it was what I'd learned from the journey of recovery from that I felt I had a lot of value that I wanted to share with other people. And so I thought, well, I need to speak about that as well. And I was terrified of speaking. So I went to Toastmasters first, and then I joined the Professional Speaking Association. And they had this competition, the Speaker Factor competition, and I'd only just joined. And I thought, okay, it's just 5 minutes. This is a chance for me to get the courage to just share my story for 5 minutes. I can do that. So I entered the competition, and there was, I think, 13 other contestants, yourself included, I think. And so, I shared my story. And what then happened, I was totally unprepared for, because I won that round, the London round, which was incredible.
It was a phenomenal speech, and I remember everybody in the audience was just, you said it amazingly, and I know that the content was very powerful and strong, but also you delivered it in such a way where you actually relived the experience that you'd had surrounding that situation. So that made it incredibly powerful. I don't want to take you off track with where you're going, but it made it very, very powerful. But I imagine having to put yourself to re-embody that situation would have been very triggering.
Yes, and I thought it was just going to be that one time,
Right.
but having won the round,
Yes.
which was incredible, and I think you remember I was very emotional because I just so wasn't expecting it, but it felt like a real validation. But then I went through to the national semi-finals, and that was, you know, a whole other ball game, and it was great because I had some coaching around that from other people in the PSA. But what kept happening was I was going back to the point of the trauma, back to the point of the trauma, back to the point of the trauma. And in doing so, and going back to the worst moment of my life constantly, it was just really re-triggering and re-traumatizing. And on the back of that, I also read a book called The Body Keeps the Score. Mm-hmm. And the first chapter is about a soldier who has PTSD. And I got really emotional reading that because I thought, that's me, that's what I've been struggling with for decades, not knowing that's what it was. And so I went to the doctor and asked if I could have an assessment of PTSD. And he apologised on behalf of the medical profession and said he was really sorry no one had thought to send me before. But that's how that came about, because I started to share my story.
And had you had other symptoms that the doctor kind of thought we should have picked up on these symptoms and seen them as trauma?
Yes, so I'd been, I don't know if it was misdiagnosed or diagnosed, but there was also trauma because I'd been diagnosed with depression a few times. So that seemed to be the standard thing when I would go to a doctor to say what I was struggling with. But I think PTSD was so unknown. When I was 13, when the accident happened, it wasn't even a known expression, I think. I mean, mental health wasn't an expression back then. So I got no professional help at all to come to terms with something so horrific at such a crucial time in my life. And I felt like I just had to almost split off from it just to survive. So it was always there, and it was constantly there, and it would trigger rage. You know, I had a lot of rage, flashbacks, and I felt like I was living in a glass box and the rest of the world were on the other side. And that's exactly how the soldier described it. And that's what really struck me. I thought I described that to my sister not long before, how I just felt like the whole world was there and I couldn't get to it. I was just sort of locked in this glass box. So again, it was another level of validation that actually this is why I couldn't move on. This is why, you know, well-meaning people had said, you just need to let it go. It's like, let what go? Like, this is my whole body. This is my mind that is struggling. How do I let that go?
Yes.
I just didn't know what that meant.
It wasn't about sorting it out in a kind of rational, logical way.
No.
And I mean, I know you did do some CBT, which is quite rational and logical in that and I'm sure that was very helpful to get your mind around it. But it sounds like your body needed to get around it as well.
Yes, and the emotional level. So I've had EMDR, and that really helped to access the emotion. And even now I'm having cranial osteopathy to help my nervous system to settle, because it was, you know, we talk about fight, flight or freeze. My whole nervous system was stuck in trauma for decades. And so it's just an ongoing journey to look at those different layers. But it was a real sort of affirmation for me that I was able to take back to my family and say, this is why I can't just move on. It's like my mind was literally frozen back on the school field. So I couldn't just move on from that. It needed professional help to put that back into another place in my brain that wasn't so traumatizing.
Were these flashbacks and these other symptoms released by speaking on the stage at that time, or had you been having them up until that point as well?
I'd been having them up until that point and being triggered by things like darts or archery, you know, those kind of things, because it's not, thankfully, the javelin isn't an everyday thing, but things like darts are. So anything like that, I still really struggle, to be honest, to be around anything like that.
Yeah. So what was different then once you had that experience of speaking about it that was different from the flashbacks and various symptoms you'd been having up until that point? How did things start to change?
I think it escalated for me. Okay. So I think because I've been living with it for so long, I would be triggered, but I would just keep that to myself and not really understand what was happening. But this I couldn't ignore, and it was so associated with me speaking.
And you'd let the cat out of the bag. You'd spoken about this trauma publicly now.
Yeah, exactly. And so to me it was obvious that it was that, because I was talking about that, and this was my direct response to that. And so yeah, it was a relief. It was, as I say, it was like a validation, like that it wasn't my fault that I couldn't just pull myself together and move on.
It must have been such a strange experience as well, that while you were reliving the trauma, you were getting such a positive reception for your speech. People were clapping you and saying, well done, and that was amazing. And there was you in the height of the thing that was kind of the worst thing you'd ever done, being received as though, as it being such a wonderful thing that you've just done.
Yeah.
You know, you just spoken really well and shared your story really powerfully, and to everybody's kind of applause.
Yeah.
That must have been a kind of a weird, like, mismatch or dissonant type of experience. Cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, and no one's actually really spoken to that before, but it absolutely was that. And then I felt like I was masking again, like, oh, thank you, yeah, thank you. And I was thinking, I was like crushed inside, like completely re-traumatized and thinking this is not something to celebrate. Like what happened is not something to celebrate. And
so confusing.
So confusing. And my book was coming out as well. And I did a TEDx talk and it all just was coming at the same time. So it was like an escalation. And then I had one story in The Guardian, and then every online newspaper just took the story, ran with it without my permission. And it was...
And even the headline was very provocative. It was like, it was just to make it sell papers. And it was, you, because I think you said you signed off on the article itself.
Yes, exactly. So they said I could have final editing approval, which I did. It was already great. And then the headline, you know, I killed my friend, and just, and then I felt sick. And then I was really worried if my friend's family were going to be watching it, because she was a friend of mine that died. And
I remember you saying as well that there was a real sense when you were sharing your story back then, even, or maybe when we bumped into each other some years later, because I didn't realise you'd been triggered.
Yes.
So much by this experience. I had no idea until we re-met.
Yeah.
Can't remember how long later, maybe 4 or 5 years later.
Yeah.
And you said you'd spent this entire time dealing with the fallout from speaking about it.
Yeah.
But that you said you felt it wasn't I felt it wasn't my story to tell. It was theirs. And yet clearly it is your story as well.
Yes.
It's, you know, it's two-sided story, you know.
Yeah. And I think I did feel that at the time. I just felt like it was too much pressure. I mean, it was literally, I was in the spotlight nationally and I'd put myself there. That was the thing that I was struggling with as well. So I was trying to still deal with this trauma while I was in the media. I was on lots of podcasts, even did some TV, you know, stuff like, and I felt like I was on this train that I couldn't get off, because I'd started it, and it was really, really hard. And then in the end, probably not long after we met the second time, and I thought, I don't want to do this anymore. I just felt like I just didn't want to share. It was just too much for me, and it was just...
Did you feel that did you sometimes feel like, I'm not saying you did this, but I know that with some of my experiences in life, I sometimes feel like I don't want to use this experience in the wrong way.
Yes.
Because it's so powerful. I can just kind of use and abuse this experience, but actually it's an abuse of myself if I...
Yeah.
That makes sense to you?
Totally, yeah. And I remember it was on Facebook when all the papers had taken the story without my permission, and then somebody who was a distant relative of my friend who wrote to me and said, well, I'm glad you're making lots of money on the back of it. Oh, I feel emotional just saying it. And I'd asked permission from my friend's family before I wrote the book, before I went into The Guardian. I'm so respectful, because they were so amazing with me that it meant a lot to me. So for her to say that, like, oh, I hope you're making lots of money from blah, blah, blah. But that actually led me to a meeting with my friend's mum, and I hadn't seen her for 30 years or whatever it was at that point, which was so healing for me and so beautiful and so emotional, as you can imagine. But her mum was as compassionate as ever and just said she'd always only wanted me to be happy. And, you know, I said I thought that on some level I'd been waiting for her permission, and she said, you don't need my permission, you know. And that really sort of shifted something in me. I thought, well, if she's not holding me in this way. And she actually spoke to the family member and said, how dare you have said that to me, because she had our permission. And actually the proceeds of the book I gave to Young Minds mental health charity. So I wasn't making money from the book anyway, but that's obviously how it was, this person had perceived it. So it was a lot that happened in a very short space of time. I felt like I was in this huge washing machine and, you know, re-traumatizing. But ultimately coming through that, I think I wouldn't be where I am now if I hadn't have gone through all that to sort of another level of healing.
What do you think would have happened had you not gone and kind of opened up that can of worms again?
I think I would have just been in mental distress for the rest of my life, and I'm not sure that's a life I would have wanted to carry on living. You know, it was getting to the point where it was too much, you know, when you're just constantly in mental distress, and maybe have little bits of brief glimpses of something else, but, you know, for it to keep coming back, it was cyclical, it would come back. And I just, who wants to live a life like that? So I think ultimately it has opened me, sort of cracked me right open, which is what needed to happen. I think I said to you a quote, but there's a brilliant quote by Rumi who says, the wound is where the light enters. And I love that quote.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
And just even today coming here, I thought, actually, the wound is also where the light exits, where I believe we've got like this inner light, and through the wound that we can shine that light outwards. And so...
And it doesn't diminish that inner light, does
no,
it? It actually
amplifies it. Yeah, exactly. And I know there was this story of the Golden Buddha, if I can tell that, which was there was a golden statue in Thailand in the 1700s, and there was a Burmese invasion. And so the Thai monks, to save this golden statue, they covered it in mud and clay so that the armies wouldn't want to steal it. And it was really successful. They didn't steal it. And then what happened was a lot of people were killed. And so people didn't realise that this was the Golden Buddha. So for centuries, it was still sort of revered, but as a mud clay version of the Buddha. And then one day, I think it was a couple of centuries later, there was a monk was nearby and a bit fell off, and he saw this sort of chink of gold and thought, wow, you know, what's going on? And so they chipped away very carefully and uncovered this Golden Buddha underneath. And I like to think that's sort of how we are, that we are this sort of Golden Buddha inside, and then through life experiences, we add on these layers of clay to protect ourselves. But then we forget we're the Golden Buddha. And I think when something happens like I went through, it sort of cracks it open, and then the light, you can see that light.
Yeah.
And so for me, that's been a process of just removing all the armour, all the mud and the clay.
That's wonderful. And, you know, I love both of those two metaphors, which work together so beautifully.
Yes.
And so as you're allowing your light to shine out, rather than continuing to keep it covered up, where would you like that light to touch people, and how?
I think light, and for me light also means love, is just so needed in this crazy world we're living in. I mean, it's just, you know, there's trauma everywhere we look, to be honest. We don't have to look very far. And I think from everything I've learned about myself, you know, I used to think I was this monster that had done something really awful, and then I came to realise that none of that was my fault. But in thinking that I was that monster, it stopped me from looking inside, and then starting to look inside and realising there was just traumatised younger me's that I'd rejected, because, you know, we talk about perfectly flawed, but I thought I had to be perfect and not show any of my flaws, of which I thought I had lots. And so it was this sort of constant struggle to try and maintain that. But in turning inwards, after I went to the doctor and got some help to do that, and realising it was these younger me's that were just absolutely traumatised, then I realised how much I'd been beating myself up, how much I'd been hurting myself over the years in blaming myself. And in that realisation, I started to have compassion. And for me, that's what's needed in the world. Is we're all too quick to judge each other and blame and criticise when we've got no idea what another person is going through. hopefully not as traumatic as the start that I had in life, but it doesn't matter. Whatever you've been through, whatever experience, if it's painful and it's causing you to act in a way that isn't balanced, then I think we need more compassion for that rather than expecting people to be perfect. And what does that mean anyway? I think in finding that acceptance of all those parts, of all those flawed, in inverted commas, parts, then that's really how I want to shine my light, is to help people to not feel there's something wrong with them, as I did, that actually we're all human. We all make mistakes. We've all done some things we might regret. We might have done accidents like I did, but actually we're all human. And if we can accept that and actually love each other nonetheless, then that's a different world that we can create.
Accept that we're all perfectly flawed.
Yeah, exactly.
And it also strikes me that it's the compassion that we need to have is not just for the flaws in others, but the very first place, before we can ever accept other people's flaws, really, is to just do it for ourselves, isn't it? To just boldly kind of go within and say, okay, here's a flaw, here's a failure, here's a fluff up.
The more I've done that, the more I've realised that I don't even then see them as flaws. You know, what I perceived as flaws are actually, like I say, just parts of me in pain. And so I don't want to reject those parts of me. I want to nurture those parts, and I want to thrive now. That's really where my focus is in life. I've been through the surviving part, and now I want to move into, you know, much more of the thriving part, which I am doing. But I just, you know, that's the path that I'm on now, is to keep being more of that and helping other people to be that as well.
And a sort of reintegration of all those parts. We were talking before, as I was sharing one of my former mentor, David Grove, who worked a lot with allowing people who are traumatized to not force their parts to just sort of join the main party, but instead spread them out and allow all these different traumatized younger selves to have their own identity and to develop and to grow, and not to try and integrate them too soon, which I think sometimes happens for those that are interested in NLP. There are some parts integration processes, and very good for very trivial matters. But for very deep level trauma, where parts of the self have been arrested in development at different ages, where we can have flashbacks, but, you know, bodily flashbacks. I think you talked about that, and we can talk about that in a moment. But those things can't be rushed. We you know, we can talk about quick, rapid therapy, but those things can't be rushed. And sometimes they need to actually be given the chance for a voice of their own, not from the main person taking control. But it's like having a team. A team is composed of all members. It's not a top-down thing. It needs each part to express itself, so that together they can work in an integrated manner at the right time and sort of come together as and when. I don't know what your thoughts are on any of that. And I, through my EMDR journey predominantly, but eye movement desensitization reprocessing.
Such a mouthful, but I sort of reclaimed a lot of those younger me's, and I have an image now where we're sort of all standing in a circle holding hands. It's like every sort of version of me, but we're together now, and
all accepted,
all welcome, all validated. I think that was a big thing. And not having the professional help when I was a teenager, I just didn't get any real validation of my feelings. You know, it was, and that was really detrimental. So so you divorced yourself almost. You you are a horror, you're a monster, the words you've used. You're a monster, I'm not accepting you. And then just tried to push them all away, and they would bubble up and try and get my attention, and I would find ways to cope. You know, in my 20s I took a lot of ecstasy, just trying to numb the pain and self-medicate. But
on the party scene,
because there I took ecstasy, all my pain went away.
Felt fantastic.
I belonged. I had a community of people. I felt
could
confident.
Dance the night away. There's no. I mean, ecstasy obviously has been shown, or MDMA has been used in. You know, there's more and more trials in that in clinical senses. But, you know, so there must have been a lot of positives that came from using ecstasy at that time.
Yeah. And also, you know, it was very detrimental at the same time because I just wanted to take more and more. And, you know, in the end, you know, I was really spiraling out of control, I think. But looking back, I'm just surprised I was even still alive, to be honest, from everything that I'd gone through and not had any help. I remember going to my mum sent me to the doctor. When I was 13 and it happened, our doctor said it didn't even need to go on my medical record. It wasn't serious enough.
Wow.
And then a year later, my mum thought I was depressed, so I went to see the doctor. And before even listening to what I had to say, he said, "Depression, my dear, is a serious clinical condition. I don't think you're depressed," and then sent me out.
Oh.
So that was my two experiences. And then when I was at uni...
Sort of, how dare you even come to
How
a doctor?
dare you? I'm the doctor. How dare you tell me you think you're depressed when I'd said my mum thought it?
Or even whether you're depressed or not, but how dare you come to a doctor?
Yeah.
You know,
when
bothering a doctor when you're...
Yeah. So that, obviously then I thought, I'm just going to have to keep all this inside. You know, obviously I can't speak to anyone about it. There was no therapists, or I couldn't even speak about it at home, which is a whole other story. But, you know, my stepdad was very mentally abusive and wouldn't have my friend's name mentioned at home. So it was such a difficult time. And then I, at uni, thought, right, I'm going to go.
Well, didn't you leave home when you were at A-levels?
I did. I left home, because the situation at home was just so difficult. And I think this is the thing.
So you're only 16 and you were living on your own, or with somebody else in a
council flat in a town which was far away from where I was living, which was near the school. So it was much further away, and it was...
So getting yourself to school, doing your A-levels, dealing with all this trauma, but unbeknownst to you because it wasn't diagnosed, so you had no idea. Yeah,
exactly. I just knew I couldn't take it anymore at home, and I think it was my survival instinct, and also the strength that I've always had was I just knew. I think I'd had this argument with my stepdad, and something snapped, and I thought, no more. And that's happened to me a couple of times. In my life, no more. That's it. You know, I've got to get out. That's it. I've had enough.
Good for you. That's like this, you know, the animalistic sort of survival instinct kicks in and goes, that I can't tolerate this anymore, and this is not a good place for me to be. Yeah. And that's so empowering to make that move.
Looking back, I just think, wow, you know, that was incredible, because I took myself away from comfort and familiarity, and suddenly I was looking after myself.
No idea whether you could cope on your own.
No, exactly. Anna was working part-time in Littlewoods, if you remember that, on a Saturday. So I used to go, and so I was studying in the week, and I used to work part-time at the weekends. And you know, I got my A-levels, which was incredible, but I didn't get the grades that I knew I could have got, and that did upset me. But looking back, I think the fact that I got A-levels is incredible. And I went off to university.
Well, you did amazingly.
Yeah. And then I had this doctor there. So I came to the point, I think it was at the end of my first year, and I was really starting to unravel because I was away from everything. And I was missing lectures, and my tutor actually called me in and said, "You've been missing lectures," and blah, blah. And I just burst out crying, and everything came out. And she then was my biggest champion. You know, I'm so grateful to her because she really supported me then through uni.
So was that the first time you'd really had a sympathetic ear?
I think so, yeah. I think it must have been. It was just so profound for me, you know, that she didn't say, right, you got to leave uni. She was like, right, how can I help you to stay here? You know, I want to help you. And she helped me get different accommodation. In my third year, she gave me a placement in Paris because I was doing French and business studies. And there was only 2 placements for the whole year. Everyone else had to find their own. So, you know, she really did look after me, and that was brilliant. And I think...
Well, you needed it.
I needed it.
Yeah.
And I think because I'd opened up to her, I thought, right, let me go. I think maybe she even encouraged me to go and speak to someone. And so I went in to see this guy and...
Counsellor?
He was... I can't remember the exact name, but it was... He usually dealt with people with eating disorders. Oh. So he was...
Did you have an eating disorder?
No.
No.
Exactly.
So it wasn't his speciality.
And it was another man. I hate to say it, but this was 3 men. And so it was like, again, it was like I couldn't stop everything was coming out. And he said, can you please stop and speak clearly and slow down, because I'm trying to make some notes.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So I didn't go back.
No.
And again, it was, so detrimental for me. And then I just thought, well, I just can't do, medical profession aren't there for me. And then someone gave me ecstasy and I was like, oh, okay, I can medicate myself then. Yeah. And not that I'm advocating drugs, but for me, actually, it was sort of lifesaver at that time. I can understand why people do take drugs. And again, people are so quick to judge, well, you shouldn't have taken drugs, or you shouldn't, and you've got no idea the pain, the mental pain, torture that people might be going through, that actually means it's the only relief they're getting.
Well, I mean, apart from anything else, a lot of university students might dabble in drugs anyway. But you had something that you needed to kind of escape from. Yeah. A very, so you had a very powerful motivator as well. Yeah. And so having that experience with MDMA of feeling really good, it must have been such a huge relief from the other side. So in a way, no wonder that would have fueled maybe overdoing it on the drugs front. Yeah, and I felt connection, and before then I'd felt complete disconnection. Like feeling the PTSD and feeling like I was living in a glass block and everyone was on the outside. But when I was on ecstasy, I was a part of everything. And that inner critical voice inside my head that was just shouting abuse at me all day long, shut up. So there's a real trust and honesty. I mean, I think it's fascinating that it's now back in use to help people recover from trauma, and I'm glad it's being investigated. But clearly at that time you didn't have anyone to guide you, so not only could you have taken who knows what, but also stuff that would have been laced into it, so it would have been good pure ecstasy, but also you weren't necessarily in safe hands, were you? No. So then what happened? Did you have a car accident? Yes, I did. Well, this went on for a few years where I was working. So I left uni and I was in the corporate world in sales. So I'd have my suit on in the week and then go out every weekend and just get off my head. And it was like literally like two different people. And that was exhausting. Yes. Wearing all these different masks. Yes. But the drug use was escalating. And in my late 20s, one night I was going out for the night and I was coming up to a set of traffic lights and they were on green. And then I saw a black taxi. I was in London to my left and it was pulling out. And so I panicked and thought, have the lights changed? I was like, no, the lights are on green. So I carried on. For some reason, he sped up. And so I crashed into him in the intersection. And again, it was such a shock. I think I was still holding the original trauma in my system and then had this. And so I sort of got out of the car and I was sort of dazed thinking, what's just happened? And a passerby ran over and said, just to let you know, they've just come out of a one-way street the wrong way. And I looked and they were right. So it was entirely the taxi driver's fault. Anyway, he gave me his number and he had someone in the back of the taxi, drove off. So I was there and I was quite badly injured, but I know if I say whiplash, people think it's something that's quite not too serious, but actually mine was quite severe and my right shoulder was raised slightly from the impact. So, and it was a real wake-up call, I think. I think the shock of it almost shocked me out of this destructive life that I'd been living for the last few years. And I had to move out of London to stay with family while I recovered. Just a moment on that thing, because I think that's a very interesting phenomena that people don't often talk about, that the physical shock shocked you mentally and emotionally out of a situation that you had, the pattern that you'd been in, and the way of thinking you'd been, and it's unusual to think of it in that way, that the physical shock had that component to just completely say, almost draw a line, say, okay, I can't carry on doing things that way.
Yeah, it was like a pattern interrupt is what they call it, isn't it? But it was
interrupt,
huge.
Yeah.
It was a huge pattern interrupt that was like, I was like, what is going on? And then what am I doing? And I really was asking those questions, like, why was I born to live in so much misery and create so much misery? Like, what is the purpose? And I was asking these really big questions, like, what is the purpose of life?
Was that after that?
After
you
it.
started to ask these questions.
Yeah.
What's the purpose? Why we? So you had
Why am I here? And
had you thought sort of subliminally that you had been born to cause destruction?
yeah.
And now you were kind of going,
what is the point? What's the purpose? Is that the purpose that I'm here? And I think asking those questions sort of set something in motion for me to find the answers to those questions in a different way. It's really interesting when I look back at that. But having those few months out of London and away from the clubbing scene, my whole life was revolved around it. In my whole community, my whole sense of belonging, the escape from the pain. And so I was away from all of that. And it just gave me that space to think, is that, if I carry on, I mean, I was already sort of late 20s at this point. What is my life going to be if I carry on? And I seriously think I wouldn't still be here if I carried on the way I was going. It was very self-destructive. And so on the back of that, I thought, well, the only way for me to make any sort of change is to move out of London, which again took a lot of courage, because there was a lot there in London. It was my life, it was my identity, it was
friends.
Yeah. And so I moved up to Leeds and got a job there in hotel sales up there, and had some, time away again. And then because of the car crash, I got a big payout from that because it wasn't my fault and because of my injuries. And also a great uncle passed away, and I got some money from that. It was like everything sort of came together, and I thought, I'm going to go travelling. I'd always wanted to go travelling. I'd been on holiday a couple of times. I just felt very different. So I thought I was too old. I was early 30s at this point. I thought I was too old. I wasn't too old at all. But I went off for a year that turned into 16 months.
Wow.
And that changed everything, that trip.
Wonderful, wonderful. So the amazing thing about travelling is you get to see so many different perspectives, don't you? And you're not attached to whatever identity that formulates and kind of crusts around us in our lives. You just go off and you can just be a fresh new you in every interaction. So what happened during that journey that changed things, or that travel?
I mean, it was exactly as you said, and I also nobody knew me, so I could be anyone if I wanted to be, but I ended up being just myself without your story. Without the story.
You left the story behind.
I did. Yeah. Because I didn't feel I had the right to be happy when I was in the UK. But somehow when I was away, that dropped for that time.
Yes.
It's really interesting.
It's incredible, isn't it? It's like, who would we all be without our story?
Yeah.
I think that's Byron Katie asked the question, who would you be without your story? And that's such a good example of it. And that's why kind of meeting new people and having fresh perspectives and travelling can be so powerful.
It really was. And people were just seeing me and liking me, and there was no drugs, and that hadn't happened to me in all of my 20s because I'd been taking drugs. So that really sort of bit by bit, I started to emerge more fully. But in the first stages, I was in India, and I'd only intended to go for 2 weeks, and I ended up staying 5 months because I had such a profound experience there. And there was a girl there, a Dutch girl, and she said, "Can I give you Reiki? I've just trained in it." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And she said, "Well, it sounds a bit weird, so if you're up for it, I'll give you the experience and then we can talk about it. You just lie down fully clothed." And I said, "Oh, I'm open to new experiences. That's what this whole trip is about." So I lay down and I was on the beach with the waves. It was the most amazing setting for a start. And she started this Reiki session, which I now know is universal energy healing. And it's a good job she didn't tell me that before.
Because you would have been cynical.
I would have been cynical. Yeah, absolutely. I was totally closed off to anything around that. And thought it was all woo-woo and ridiculous. And so here I am in India thinking, well, I'm just lying here, what is she doing? She didn't even put her hands on me. So I'm sort of thinking, well, and then I started to feel sort of lighter, and I started to feel sort of more joyful. And I thought, what is going on? And it almost was ecstatic in the end, this feeling. And I was like, I don't know what's going on, but I like it. You know, it was, and I felt this connection for the first time
so
without
was it
drugs.
Like the ecstasy?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. It was like that. And I hadn't had any drugs. And so it was a really interesting experience. And she'd only just trained in it. And so she was, when I came out of it, she said, oh, how was that? And I was like, it's like my whole world had just changed. I was like, how was that? That was pretty amazing. And she was like, oh, really? Oh, and so that opened a door, I think, you know, and
to know that you could naturally feel that way. It's possible for you.
It's possible. And how was that possible? You know, when she explained it, and I was like, this just sounds ridiculous. Like, how does that work? That just, you know, seems like a load of mumbo jumbo. And but I'd had this visceral experience without knowing what it was. So
your body isn't lying.
The body isn't lying. So, you know, the body keeps the score again, and the body knows. And so it was a pure experience for me because I had no idea what was going on. And so that sort of opened that door, and that led me down this, and I felt like Willy Wonka or something like that, you know, just like, oh, let me try all these different things then while I'm traveling, and who knows what they'll bring. And I did some meditation and all sorts of, you know, what was it, you know, the ecstatic dancing things. And
is that the 5 rhythms?
5 rhythms I did, all of that. And I was just laughing to myself thinking, oh God, if people at home could see me now, they think I've lost the plot. But I actually felt like I was finding the plot. That was the interesting thing.
That is interesting,
Yeah. So I thought people will think I'm crazy, because I thought, am I going crazy? And I thought, actually, if this is crazy, then bring it on, because
I'll go crazy this way.
I'll go, exactly. Because I was getting so much from it. So that was the start of that.
I can really appreciate that. But also, I think the lure when there is trauma in the body, and I speak from my own experience around this, where there's an inkling of something feeling really good, whether that's ecstasy or something maybe, you know, that was more positive for you as you were finding positive healing. That lure can be so overwhelmingly powerful. We just don't want to go back to ourselves. And I've had escapades as well where I've escaped across the ocean. Often I just go sailing and I go and sail to somewhere else, and then once I sailed over to Antigua across the Atlantic, and then I just didn't want to come back. And every now and again, and I stayed out there working on boats and things, and I had to keep going, I know I've got a life in London. I kind of better go back at some stage. But it was so liberating and freeing to be there. So I really understand what you're saying, and it's also a real step towards healing as well. Even though it feels like a dream, it's actually really a tangible and very valuable step towards your healing. That's a great point you made, because at the end of that trip I didn't want to come back. I felt like I'd failed in the fact that I couldn't stay out there longer, even though I was away 16 months in the end. I just didn't want to come back because I felt like I was coming back to all the trauma, which I was really. And who wants to come back to that, to be honest? So when I came back, I really struggled. I felt like I was almost trying to fit back into that life, and that life was saying no. It sort of reminds me, in a way, I've got to say this at this point, which is like the hero's journey. And the completion of the hero. So the hero goes off from their ordinary world, goes off into the extraordinary world, experiences all these battles and fights, and learns and grows and develops traits and things. But the hero's journey is not complete until the hero can come home. But the hero isn't ready to come home any earlier, and it sounds like you weren't ready. You know, you had come home prematurely because you hadn't finished that healing journey, so you weren't ready to come home and embody the new Liz. You had to be the old. You were still learning to be this new person, but when you went back home, you had to go back and be your old person, which happens to so many of us. Just when we go back to, say, our family homes, where people revert to being the kid that they used to be, even though they've grown up and they might be married and whatever else, but then they go back to their family home and it doesn't
feel like right back there.
They're back being a kid. So so sorry to interrupt you there, but I thought that was just it kind of just sounded like you'd gone back too soon for you.
I did, and it was such dissonance then. It was like, and my back went. It's really interesting. The body keeps the score.
Yes.
So I was flat out on my back, and again that gave me this time to reflect and to, obviously it was in pain as well, but I actually had a vision during that time. I know that sounds strange, but it was a really strong image that felt different viscerally to other thoughts and images that I had. And it was me on a stage, me speaking on a stage. Right. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous, because at that point, you know, my self-esteem was so low and I would never have done public speaking. But that stayed with me. It was like, even to the point where I was on the TEDx stage and I said to myself, this is what I was seeing. So it was really interesting that actually that did guide me to become a speaker, because I'd had that image. But I had a rough few years where I was tussling back in the UK and I was finding I was going more and more back, not taking drugs or anything like that, but just trying to fit myself back into the mold that I was in before. And then I came to the point where I was in such pain emotionally, mentally. It was like in my head, trying to describe it, but it was like a whirlwind and I just couldn't get it to stop. And I was trying to function and pretend I was okay. And I got to the point where I thought, you know what, if I'm going to be in this much pain, I'd rather be in India. Because when I was in India, I'd seen lots of people who were lost, like emotionally lost, and they just fitted in. They sort of welcomed there. And I thought, you know what, if that's, maybe there's a home for me there if I go back. Yeah. And so went back to India, and oh God, I've got so much to be grateful to India for both of those trips. So I was there. The first time I was there for 5 months. Then I went on to New Zealand, Australia, and places. But this time I was there nearly a year, and I was in an ashram, like a spiritual ashram place, and I thought it was going to be peaceful. It was on the banks of the River Ganges and the Himalayas, and there were so many spiritual pilgrims coming every day. It was so noisy. So I went to the head of the ashram and I said, it was actually his American assistant. And I said, I'm going to have to go. And she said, what are you looking for? And I said, well, I'm looking for peace. And she said, if you can't find peace on the banks of the River Ganges, you're not going to find it anywhere. Because to them, it's like the Mecca, the holy Mecca, spiritual. And I said, but it's just so noisy here and blah, blah, blah. And she said, of course you can go if you want. But what I'd like to suggest is if you could come to the ashram school every day and just hang out with the kids. I'm not expecting you to be a teacher. Just go and hang out with the kids and just see what happens if you're prepared to stay. And she did it so well. It wasn't like you have to stay. It was, you know. And I said, okay, well, I'll give that a go, thinking, you know, well, I'll go next week then, sort of thing. And the first day I went down to the ashram school and the head was there, and it was for the poor local children. And they did a sitting in the morning and the afternoon. This was the younger kids in the morning, from 3 to 8. So I walked in, and even though she'd said I wasn't going to be a teacher, the head teacher said, I've put 2 classes together and I'll be back in an hour. And she walked out and left me with these kids. And they were not the tiny ones, but maybe 4, 5, 6, something like that. So I was just standing like a white giant in front of these tiny, gorgeous Indian kids with the huge eyes just staring at me. And I started to sweat. And I was thinking, I couldn't speak Hindu and they couldn't speak English. So like, how is this going to work? And then I just had this inspired thought. And I started to sing, the wheels on the bus go round and round, round and round. And I started to sing that song, and I was making up all these different, I couldn't remember the words, so I was just making things up. I thought they won't know any different. But the kids got up and they were mimicking me, copying me, and trying to sing. Oh, honestly, that opened my heart. It was like one of the most beautiful experiences. So after an hour, the head came back, and I was doing heads and shoulders, knees and toes, anything I could think of. And she came back and said, will you come back again? And I said, well, I'll come back if you're here. And if you can translate some of the words, so they're learning English, then, you know, this could work. And so my mum sent me a CD called Singing English. And it was like, hello, hello, how are you? So I would sing a song, the head would translate it. We'd just make up some actions, and that's what we did. And I did that for a couple of months, and it was just beautiful. And at the end, when I left, I could hear them from my room in the ashram. They were practicing the songs without me, and I felt like this proud mother. And I went in, and they did all the songs and the actions for me, and that was amazing.
So that was obviously part of your healing journey, and you had. I know that you then had a silent retreat.
Yes.
And so there were various things, and then we kind of had the fast forward to that point where you were in the the speaking.
Speaking, yeah.
And you published your book.
Yeah.
And then you had some, and I went along to an amazing event that you had. That was your next thing, which was, what was your intention there?
I felt like really strongly I wanted to empower other women. I think as well as me going through the accident, there'd also been a lot that I had been suppressed as a girl growing up. And so I really wanted to empower women. So I had this event in a hotel in London, and lots of amazing women like you came.
What was it called?
She Who Shines.
She Who Shines, yes.
Yeah. And it was actually my book launch as well. And we had we did an event around that as well. And it was just seeing all these powerful women coming together. And I wanted to bring women together. Some of them have gone on to work together, you know, or friendships or different generations. My mum came, my sisters were there, my cousin and her daughter, as well as, you know, lots of other amazing women and people from my history. It was an amazing time, and I felt really wanted to empower women. I've done a lot around overcoming imposter syndrome. I've done personal development programs for women, just feeling that call, but also around that time started to do workplace wellbeing. So the last 8 years I've been working in organisations, looking at how to create wellbeing, and I'm doing a master's degree at the moment. So I've just started that last year, and I'm doing that in positive psychology in organisations and leadership. So it's sort of bringing everything together, the leadership, the wellbeing, performance together, and just all of my experience as well. Feels like this is the culmination, the integration of everything that I've been working towards in my life.
So what is it that you really want to be able to have women know?
I would love every woman to know that she is enough as she is, that there's nothing she needs to do to be enough, that actually she was born that way. You look at a baby, you would never look at a baby and say, you're not good enough. But some point along the way, we decide from our experiences, especially as women, that we're not enough. And I think if we could all just truly know that we are, we'd feel fundamentally different. And it's like that golden Buddha image. If we all really knew we are the golden Buddha, that is who we are, and let our light shine and let that crack through the mud protection that we've created, and just let ourselves be fully ourselves without fear of what anyone else thinks about us. And that's a huge leap forward for me. I've just got to the point where I just don't care if somebody else thinks badly of me. That's okay. They're entitled to that. It's no reflection on me. I know who I am. I've worked really hard to get here, and I know who I am. And, you know, essentially, I'm a kind, compassionate person.
You are, and you're letting your light shine.
Yeah.
And so what is it that you would love that younger you to know?
How loved she is by me. How proud I am of her for navigating the unimaginable. I mean, you know, many people going through similar things wouldn't survive, and she did. She had that strength, she had that commitment, that determination, even if it didn't feel like it that at the time. You know, in many different ways, she did incredibly well, and I wouldn't be here today without her. So I'm very grateful to her.
And how is she doing now?
She is mostly doing brilliantly. And of course, there's lots of younger me's, as we talked about. But I think the one from the accident is doing really well. And as I say, I'm working at the moment on still calming my nervous system around that. So, you know, she's very much a part of that. And so I'm still getting some ongoing support. And that may always be the case, and it might not. I'm just not putting any pressure around that. I just know that in time, all the time, I'm moving forwards and I'm feeling better. And that's all I need to focus on.
And when something gets triggered,
Yeah.
how do you respond now? Because I know that you're currently having some physical symptoms. How do you respond now that's different from how you used to?
I think now when, so I've been having a lot of dizziness recently, and looking into that, I think it is the the trauma wanting to be integrated on a deeper level. And, you know, it was just too much for that younger me to be able to deal. I understand that now. When I touch on it now and how enormous it is and how deeply painful, she couldn't have survived if she had fully felt all of that. So I keep telling her that I'm doing it now, that she doesn't have to, that I've got her, that I'm there for her.
You're big enough and strong
I'm big enough, I've got it. You know, we've been working towards this, and here we are. And
you can deal with the difficulties, and she can just be safe. And
I'm the adult that she needed back then and didn't get.
Yes.
And I love her, I protect her, I'm here for her, I'm doing the work, and I'm holding her. So often I visualise that I'm hugging her at the moment, you know, that I'm really giving her that love that she really needs to be able to feel safe enough to let go of this trauma.
I think that's so powerful, and so many people might think, oh well, you need to sort of integrate that and bring it into you, but I actually think while you've got this separate, you know, an ability to communicate with her, she was forced to be integrated into you for so long. Now you can look after her and tend to her, whereas for so long there wasn't that sense of that part of you that required so much love and support and care. And
there was rejection, you know. I rejected her because that's what I thought she was this monster, and I feel so bad about, not guilty because I don't like to carry guilt, but I'm just really sorry that that's how I felt towards her and myself. I'm just glad we found a way to be here so that I can give her that love now. And we can move forwards together in a very different way. And I'm also not afraid to reach out for professional support. You know, if I come to a place like this, the first thing I do is like, right, I need some help with this, because it's a lot, you know, in those moments, it's a lot. And so if anyone's struggling out there on your own, I'd say please do reach out and speak to someone you can find who you trust. And that is a key thing. Yeah.
So finally, Liz, what does being perfectly flawed mean to you?
I think we've touched on it in various ways throughout, but for me, it's the fact that we're all human. We are all, in inverted commas, flawed. We all have these things that we believe means that we are flawed. Nobody is perfect. It doesn't exist. And so in coming to realise that, we can accept all those parts of us which we believed were flawed. And when we come to accept all those parts of us, then, you know, we are an integrated human being. We're much happier. We can help more people, and we can love life more.
So would you say that we've just got to accept these flaws within us, and not reject them?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with us. There's nothing. I think myself, I felt that. So many people, we think there's something wrong with us, and we have to hide these things, and that leads to self-medication. A lot of people drink, they smoke, take drugs or whatever, because you don't want these parts to be seen. These parts are just parts in distress. And the more we can start to look at those and love those, we don't need to have the external things to try and make us feel better.
Well, Liz, it's been such an enormous pleasure to have you here today, and I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for sharing all your experiences and thoughts and wisdom and love and light with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed that episode. One of the things that I found so intriguing was how Liz had to go from thinking of herself as a monster to really understanding who she truly was, and to have greater compassion for herself, to learn to embrace herself. And in that compassion for herself, she's learned to be compassionate for all kinds of people. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure that you like it and you leave a review. It makes such a difference to us. And also share it with anyone else who you think could benefit from listening to this episode. Also, make sure that you subscribe, because that way you won't miss out on any future episodes. And we've got some really great ones coming up, as well as some fantastic ones in our back catalogue.